Welcome, everybody, to the Nightly News Podcast. This is Professor Paul Miller sitting in today with our head baseball coach of the Central Penn Knights men's baseball team, Coach Robert Stern. Robert, it's such a pleasure to have you on the podcast today.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, you're very welcome. And, of course, we're also being joined here today by Nightly News reporter Christian Fulp. Christian, thank you very much for being here today.
Yeah, it was great to be back down here.
Well, we got a lot to talk about. Very, very close to opening day for the Central Penn Knights, as you are scheduled to take on Williamson Trade on Sunday, March 10th, for a doubleheader at noon and 2:30. It seems like it's only a few weeks away, but yet when we look outside and we see all the snow that we have, what do you think that might impact? I mean, I don't want to sort of start off on a sour note, but when you're scheduling games this early in the season, it's got to be tricky to, try to figure out the weather.
Right. Well, it could impact the start of our season to begin with, because we don't know what March is going to bring us.
Well, and the thing is, too, I mean, just looking at the weather, it does seem like it's going to be warming up in March. But, I mean, even if it does warm up, that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be able to play, right? Explain to us what goes on behind the scenes about deciding whether a field's in playable condition.
Well, number one, with all the snow that we have out there, like right now, it saturates the field. So if it freezes up overnight, it's just going to thaw out, and then it's just going to make the field wet again.
And just be a muddy mess. Yeah,
yes,
we don't want that. So last year, and we are going to talk a lot about your history, and I just want to sort of talk about last year. So last year was an amazing season. Knights went 15-13, their first winning season in the history of Central Penn Knights men's baseball. But yet, weather was a huge factor. 16 games canceled or postponed. So I got to ask you, you got to play some early season games, but then it was almost a month before you got to play another game, right?
Correct. I think it was about a total of maybe 3 weeks. And with that said, we could have played a few games against maybe Penn State York or Penn State Hazleton, and for some reason they wanted to back out.
Any indication on why that was?
I think it was just because we were starting to play some good baseball that they didn't really want to play.
Well, and looking back at the season, you started off well, and then once you came back, there was a little bit of a losing streak there. Do you think that lull had something to do with that?
Yes.
And because, I mean, it's got to be difficult. You get ready, you get out there, you get on the field, and then all of a sudden, weather causes you to miss a bunch of games, and it's tough to get that mojo back.
Right. Time away from the diamond really doesn't do you any good.
Well, Christian, we're going to talk with you about what we can look forward to for the Knights season this year. Again, looking back on last year, it was a monumental season for a couple reasons. First and foremost, of course, the winning season. But secondly, we had the opportunity to start broadcasting some of the games. And of course, I talked with Christian about this, and he shared why that meant so much to him. What does it mean to you, Coach, as the coach of the team? What does that mean to you to be able to know that your games are being broadcast live?
Well, it's going to mean a lot, because some of the kids that are local, their parents get to watch the game on YouTube and see their children away from home.
Were you ever able to use that as any type of coaching? I mean, were you able to watch back on some of the tape and see if, there were some adjustments that could be made by using that tape that we had?
Oh, yes, sir. Very much so.
Well, I'm glad to hear that, because honestly, we're not just doing it. I mean, a main part of the reason is because not only do we want friends and family to tune in, and of course, Christian even went as far as to say that his daughter, who's just a tyke right now, when she gets older, she can go back to YouTube and look at some of the games that he got to play. But when you think about it from a coaching perspective, it's got to be amazing that you now have some kind of video that you can go back and look at. Even if it's just trying to for a future matchup. If you're playing Williamson Trade at the beginning of the year, now you've got some video on them and of course they have video on you to a certain point. But I think that's hopefully going to be very, very useful for the team.
And yes, sir. Not only that, it's also a great recruiting tool.
Yeah, and for somebody who's not from this area, you can say, hey, your parents can watch every home game that you play. And honestly, between us and of course all of our listeners, our goal long term is to do as many of these games as possible. Right now, we're just trying to feel some things out. We've got a crew already ready to go. We've already got 4 people that are going to be at all the games. So if one person can't be there, we've got coverage. But our goal is to be at every single home game this year. I certainly hope that the weather cooperates and allows us to do that. Well, Coach, I want to talk a little bit about your history. You've been coaching since 1988. This is your 30th year coaching. What does that mean? What does that number mean to you?
The first number that comes to me means I'm getting old.
Well, that's not why I brought that up. But 30 years. I mean, looking back, does it seem like it's been that long?
No, it hasn't. But it's a milestone. But it goes to show that I've been coaching consistently. It gives me something, not something to do, but it's something I look forward to doing every summer, spring and summer.
Well, and obviously you have to be passionate about doing this. It's something that you are helping not only the players get better, you're also teaching them life skills too. Can you talk about that? Can you talk about some of the life skills that you're sharing with these students?
Yes. When guys move on in life, they come back and they see you maybe in a grocery store, and you might not remember who they are, but they will say, hey, he used to be my teener coach back in 1992, or he used to be my high school coach back in 2001, or like Christian had mentioned that I was his Legion coach back in 2013. Now I'm his college baseball coach, so that's something that's a milestone right there. I coached this kid when he was 15 years old. Now he's 21.
Well, Christian, let's go to you with that. So what he's talking about is you played for the Paxton Legion. Coach Stern coached the Paxton Legion from 2013 to 2015. Can you look back on what some of the memories were from you and Coach back in a time when you were just a high school kid?
Yeah, it was a great time. The team that I was on, I played up for the Legion. I was younger, and he had a core group of guys that he coached for a while, and that was his team. So, I came into the process and the team atmosphere, and they were already, they were all together as one, and they had, this strict mentoring process. And I just joined right in, and he took me in like I was his kid, and it was great. I loved the way they played baseball. It's
interesting, when I look back at my time playing baseball and some of the coaches that I had, I'll never forget these people. I even run into them occasionally, and while I can't necessarily think of one thing specifically about lessons that they taught me, what I do remember is that they taught me the importance of leadership on the diamond. And to be honest, in college sports, that's one of the big things, because not while we have at Central Penn College have had people from our athletics go and play professionally, especially from our basketball program, one of the biggest things to me as an instructor, when I sit down and I speak with Christian about how he's going to talk about baseball on his resume, leadership's the number one thing that comes. I've actually talked to many different people all over campus, off campus, different people from outside in the community, and the number one thing they say, college athletes come with discipline. Does that register, when you're trying to share things and you're trying to teach these young people how to be leaders, is that something that they can take away and transfer to other skills and to other jobs?
Most definitely, because that's the first thing I talk about is being a disciplined baseball player within yourself, and it carries on with the team.
Now, Christian, when you think about and you look back, and obviously you still have this season and hopefully one more season after this, when you think about how you're going to transfer some of the skills that you're using on the field into the workplace, what might some of those be outside of some of the things that we've talked about?
I would definitely say confidence and teamwork. Working with a team is everything. The guys are more like family to you at that point, and working well with others is great in the job world, so it's just perfect. It goes hand in hand.
I mean, you make a perfect example right there. So when I'm in the classroom, I do, and Christian will back me up here, I assign a lot of group work. And it's like a collective sigh or groan any time that I introduce a group project. So many college students don't want to do it because they always say, somebody else might not pull their own weight, and I might end up having to do a lot more of the project than maybe I otherwise would have had to in a different group. But what I try to explain is the reason that I do group work is, guess what? When you go out into your career, you're going to be working with other people all the time. Even though I teach my students in a class by myself, I can't even count how many different groups, whether it's different committees I'm in as a faculty member, whether it's the Nightly News Media Club, and I'm working with these great students on the live streaming initiatives and the podcasts. I mean, it's constant that I'm working and have to collaborate with other people. And to me, I think sports is a great way to teach that teamwork. So I think that that's a wonderful point that you made there, Christian. Well, Coach Stern, I want to talk about some of your history in baseball. So we'd mentioned that you coached for starting since 1988, but you played ball at Harrisburg High, and then you went on to play Twilight ball for 15 seasons. Was it a labor of love there with Twilight? That because I mean, it's not like there's it's not like you're in the major leagues and you're getting big paychecks. I mean, it's in fact you don't get paid in Twilight.
No, sir. It has to be a labor of love because it's just for fun. It's just local guys that after work you go play some baseball. It's kids who come home from college to try to stay sharp for when they want to go back to school. Back then when we played, it was like you were playing for something when you actually weren't playing for anything. You're playing for pride.
Well, what position did you play for the most part?
I caught.
Okay, you're a catcher. Now, what I find it interesting that a lot of very, very good coaches were catchers. Why do you think that is?
Well, you run the field. You're a leader. You see everything in front of you. Basically, I wanted to be a catcher when I was younger. So once I learned how to catch, it was just like, this is what I'm going to do.
Now, how does that, you're on the field being a catcher, how does that change maybe how you work with the catchers that you work with on the team?
Well, I try to give everybody equal treatment. But when we're at practice, the last 2 workouts I had, I did take the catchers to the side. We went to a different room, and I ran through catching drills that they're going to have to do to stay in shape, to catch maybe a doubleheader or 4 games in a weekend.
I mean,
it's a tough job.
Absolutely. Catching is, without question, the most demanding position on the field. There's no question. But you've coached a wide variety of different teams, Coach Stern. Currently, obviously, you're our Central Penn coach. You've been here since 2017. Prior to that, you were the assistant coach for Harrisburg High. You also work with a baseball team over the summer, an AAU team. This year, you're going to be 18 and under. You also worked with the Paxton Legion, and I'm sure a wide variety of other places. What is the difference coaching college ball versus, other than age, of course, than some of the other experiences you had, whether it's high school or AAU ball, which is under 18?
It's more strategic in college. Guys are older, a little bit smarter, bigger, stronger. So some of the aspects of college baseball towards youth baseball is a little different. Youth baseball, you can let it just like run its course, let talent take over. But sometimes, it becomes more of a thinking game as you get older also.
So you guys have played, you're already back at practice. You've been practicing for much of the off season. We're going to look forward to this year. So last year, again, an amazing season, 15 and 13, with an unbelievable run there in the center of the season. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, you guys won, 10 out of 11 games there in the middle of the season, right?
10 of 13.
What was the key when you got on that winning streak last year? What was just everything clicking?
We actually came together as a unit. That was at first when we first started, we didn't come together as a unit. And I thought that, when I first started here, I was like, man, I'm trying to win these guys over. I'm trying to win them over. And once we got that first win against Penn State, Mount Alto down there, because we never beat them in Central Penn's history, once we won that game down there, I think our confidence went from there. So we won 7 of 8 from there, then another 5 out of 6.
It was an incredible run. So I want to talk to you a little bit about some changes for this year. So obviously this year, you were disappointed that you didn't make the Small College World Series last year. There was certainly thought at the end of the season that you guys had a decent shot to make it. Unfortunately, didn't happen quite the way you'd hoped. Would you say that that's your number one goal for this season?
Our number one goal, first of all, is to put together some wins so we can get there. We have to start playing good baseball right off the bat.
And that you said that was kind of what the issue was last year, that whether it was the weather or just, maybe not having that opportunity to be on the field quite as much, that you started off kind of in a hole and then you had to go on that crazy run to get back over 500.
Right. Well, if you look back at last year's schedule, it was a really tough schedule to begin with, playing Hood College on a Friday doubleheader there, then going down to Glenville, West Virginia, playing Salem International, which is a Division II school, and losing 3 games to them. So we lost 5 games in 3 days. And before that, I think we even played Cairn University on that Monday, which was another tough game. So our schedule was really tough at the beginning against some really tough schools. Cairn University, which is D3, Piedmont International, which is Division II school in North Carolina, Salem International, another Division II, and Hood College, which is a junior college. Those are real tough schools that we had to compete with. And we lost all those games, which was tough, except one. We did win our first game of the season against Piedmont International. But, playing those schools like that, really put us at a setback, which was okay because we knew that those were tough schools to play against. But then once we start playing schools of our size and guys start playing good baseball, then that's how we got on our streak.
Well, Christian, I just want to go to you before we flash forward to the 2019 season. Talk about when you lost those few games at the beginning of the season and you went on that road trip, and talk about that trip home. I mean, was there conversations? Were you down on yourself? Was that the time that you said, okay, enough of this, we had a tough run, but we're going to step up? Tell me a little bit of behind-the-scenes information there as a player.
So basically, we just came together as a unit, and we always talk. Like when we lose, we always talk about what we could do differently and what we need to do next. But after them 5 quick losses, we just sat down and we were like, we're better than this. And basically, that was the best teams we're going to face this year. So now we have to move on and just play every game like it's our last game, because every game's an important game.
Well, we're moving forward this year. I don't notice on the schedule, again, March 10th, you're going to be at home for Williamson Trade. You're also going to have basically your first 4 games at home, and 6 of your first 8 games will be at home in March. So, weather permitting, of course, you hopefully should be able to get off to a pretty strong start there. I see some other colleges here that I haven't quite seen before on the schedule. Scotland Prep and College of St. Joseph. Those seem to be new on your schedule this year. Is that correct?
Correct.
And what would you say, or do you know anything about them? Are they comparable size to our school, or might those be some tough matchups as well?
Well, I think Scotland School, which is a prep school, they have a lot of international ball players, so they might be tough, they might not. That remains to be seen.
Well, yeah, no one's even taken the field yet, so it's hard to say. All right, well, let's look forward at this year. Coach, of course, there's never any favorites in coaching, but if you had to look at some of your key players that are returning for this year, who are we looking at to keep an eye on?
And keep an eye on Chris Rosario.
Chris Rosario, had a huge season last year, the first baseman. Who are some of the other returning players that you're looking forward to having back out on the field?
Quentin Heckert, guy sitting to my left right now, Christian Fulp. I'm looking for him to be a leader this year.
And if I'm not mistaken, Quentin plays shortstop in pitches.
Shortstop pitch.
And then, Christian, you're a center fielder, and you also take the mound. Sure. I'll tell you had probably the most wicked curveball that I saw all last season when I was calling the games. You definitely are there. Who are some of the other pitchers that you're looking at this year?
It's Quentin, Christian.
I believe we got Max Thorpe as well.
I forgot about Max Thorpe and Freddie Barr.
So you got some great pitchers. You got some great people returning from Chris Rosario. You got Christian, Quentin. It's looking like a great season. Now, I do want to bring it. You also have some new players, some new recruits. How was the recruiting season for you over the last year?
Over the last year, it was came up a little short. I had 2 kids from Williamsport that were right on the table, but then they just fell off at the end. But Peyton Paletti, who's going to step in and be our starting catcher, is a good ball player. Then we have Christian Lair from Susquehanna Township, who's going to jump in, play some outfield and some second base for us, and probably we'll see some mound time also.
That's what I like to hear.
And I'm also looking to Jared Rivera. I'm looking for him to have a good season for us too.
Now, where would Jared slot in as far as playing in the field?
First base and DH.
First base and DH. And just for those that might not know, you guys have a DH in every game, correct?
Depends who's pitching. If Christian Fulp is pitching, I probably won't DH for him. Maybe I will. Depends on how he's been hitting the last few games.
So that's sort of an option to you, whether you want the pitcher to hit or whether you want to use that DH spot.
Correct.
I think that's an interesting part of this. One thing I did want to point out, you guys do play a lot of double headers. Now, if you do come out for the games, do understand that in Central Penn, when we have double headers, they're 7-inning ball games, basically one right after another. I mean, what's there, a 30-minute break in between?
If that.
I think it's 15.
I mean, Christian, as a player, what's it like to have to go, especially with the intensity of the games, especially say there's like a real close game, a walk-off hit, bottom of that 7th inning for you guys. What's it like to have to turn right back around and start right back up 0-0?
Well, win or loss, the guys just sit down. Emmett Endlin's mom and dad bring us snacks. They kind of rejuvenate us with that. But we just sit down and we think about what the next game is ahead of us. And I mean, we're prepared for it. We do a lot of conditioning at practice, getting our lungs ready and our bodies in good physical condition. So we're always prepared.
Well, and are your parents going to be able to come out to some of the games this year?
Yeah, definitely.
That's good. Well, hey, I don't think I've ever met them, so whenever they come out to a game, definitely let me know. I'd like to say hello and let them know how wonderful of a job you're doing. Well, Coach Stern, as we conclude the podcast today, number one, I want to thank you. Coaching can often be a thankless job. And I just want you to know that our school appreciates all the hard work that you put into being a coach. I know your players are behind you 100%, and they appreciate, and maybe if they don't now, they will someday appreciate all of the things that you're doing for them. Give me one key to success for the Knights this year for them to have a back-to-back winning season and maybe make that small college World Series.
I'm going to take it back to working in the gym. January 6th starts all there first.
And Christian, if you would had to say what's one key to the Knights returning to their winning ways, another winning season, and making that small college World Series?
I would say staying together as one and getting off to a quick and a good start.
So we're looking forward to another amazing season for Central Penn Knights baseball. Just want to go over a couple of the dates. Again, we are a little bit far away to be able to say about the weather, but as of now, March 10th is a Sunday at noon. All these games will be at Lawton Field, just off the Derry Street exit of 83. Williamson Trade will be a doubleheader at noon and 2:30 on Sunday, March 10th. On Saturday, March 16th, it'll be noon and 2:30 against Penn State Brandywine. You'll go to Penn State. It's almost like a home-and-home kind of thing. They're on the 16th and 17th, and then you'll be back on March 26th for Penn State Schuylkill at 2 and 4 on Tuesday, March 26th. Of course, you can always go to gocpcknights.com and check out the schedule at all times. Please make sure you come out to the games, but if you can't make it, you certainly can always check us out on YouTube, where our goal, the Central Penn Nightly News Media Club, our goal is to call all the home games this season. So we're really looking forward to that. I'll be back doing play-by-play for you. We'll have Brian Christiana, Tyler Coleman doing some color commentary for us as well. Well, gentlemen, thank you very much for your time today. We are looking forward to being behind you 100%, and I really just hope to see you guys make the Small College World Series this year. That would be a highlight for us.
Well, we're hoping so, too.
Well, of course. Well, I want to thank you both for coming down today. Coach Stern, thank you so much, and again, we appreciate everything you do for the school.
All right, thank you for having me here.
You're very welcome. And Christian, as always, it's always a pleasure to work with you, and man, I give you a ton of credit for what you're doing, and not only are you working, you have a family, you're doing baseball, you've stepped up with the club. I mean, do you sleep?
when I can.
What's funny is I was here this morning pretty early, and I get an email from Christian at 6:30 a.m., and I'm just sitting here thinking, wow, I'm glad to see that you're up this early. So listen, we are behind you 100%, gentlemen. So you guys hopefully share that with the baseball team, and we're looking forward to being out there on March 10th.
Okay,
Definitely.
Looking forward to it.
All right, everybody. So for the head coach of the Central Penn College Knights men's baseball team, Coach Bob Stern, and for star center fielder and pitcher, Christian Fulp, this is Professor Paul Miller, and we'll catch you next time on the Nightly News Podcast.
Hi, this is Steve Hassinger, Career Services Director. Thank you for listening to the Nightly News Podcast.
Welcome, everybody, to the Nightly News Podcast. This is Professor Paul Miller, and we are being joined by the former Senior Deputy Attorney General, John Butchar. He was for over 30 years, was a Deputy Attorney General, and then obviously worked his way up to Senior Deputy Attorney General. He did work in the tax litigation sector of our Attorney General's office, but ever since he has moved on, so he's retired, but ever since he's moved on, he has had a very close ear to the ground in terms of politics. Two main political aspects. Again, I do want to point out that we are trying to be nonpartisan here. We are not trying to take particular sides and trying to take sort of a different perspective here. But what we are going to talk about today are some specific things that are going on in basically over the last 2 years since our current president has been in office. One thing we're going to talk about later in the podcast is climate change and our backing out of the Paris Agreement. And we're also going to talk about now Trump's war on his intelligence department. We're going to talk about some issues with North Korea, Iran, Russia, and even things like ISIS and the weapons treaty withdrawal, which I was actually extremely interested to hear about when we were talking off air, John. So, John, welcome back to the podcast. We have a lot to chat about.
Thank you very much, Paul.
All right, so let's get started. What happened here is, so you've been our political correspondent for the Nightly News. I believe you've been on 4 different podcasts. You've come down here several times, and we absolutely love having you here on campus to talk about some important issues in terms of our country. One of the things that you had mentioned that you specifically wanted to talk about is how our current president, Donald Trump, is basically at war with our own intelligence agencies. What do you mean by this?
Well, I will certainly try to be objective, but I can't say this is going to sound to be nonpartisan because this does focus on Trump's policies. Our intelligence community has a long and rich tradition and one of the best intelligence communities in the world. And they've always worked very closely with the president, and the president relies on them for his briefings, for his knowledge about who's doing what actors are doing what that we should monitor and or to look to counter. And all the security agencies in the United States have come up, as they've come up with certain findings, certain facts, we now have a president who is openly denying that and siding with what are basically our major adversaries in the world. For example, on the Russian probe, the witch hunt, as Donald Trump calls it, there's no question we now have clear evidence that the Russians took extraordinary steps to tamper with the democratic process in the 2016 election and even before. And this is not just going on with the United States. The Russians have been actively trying to impact the democratic process in many different countries. So we're not uniquely a victim here.
To what end, though? Just explain to listeners maybe a little bit more. Why would Russia go to all of this trouble to impact all of these elections? What's their end goal?
Well, their end goal is to destabilize those countries, make them easier to influence, and or in case of some Eastern European countries, take over. We have, the annexation of part of the Ukraine by Russia in the past few years. But we have, there's no question, our intelligence agencies even determine exactly how many Russian agents were working through cyber hacking to impact the election, to spread false information about Hillary Clinton, and to try to secure the election for Donald Trump. We have the names of the agents. The facts are voluminous as to what went on with Russia. Well, Donald Trump still denies it, and because Vladimir Putin told him we're not doing that. So on one hand, we have 17 different U.S. intelligence agencies with dedicated personnel working to find the facts, to present the facts to the president so he can make reasonable, rational decisions. And he says, well, I just don't buy it. I'll believe our enemy because he says no. And the same thing's going on with North Korea, Kim Jong-un. Donald Trump met with him, and he's another dictator that Donald Trump likes. And, of course, Donald Trump stated after his meeting with Kim Jong-un that the nuclear problem's over. He's agreed to dismantle his nuclear program. Our agencies now are clear that there's no evidence that he's, removing or dismantling his nuclear apparatus, and that he's in fact expanding in new areas, and they're finding new sites where there's nuclear activity or missile activity going on. Once again, Donald Trump says, I believe Kim Jong-un because he told me we're not going to do that anymore. Most recently, in the case of ISIS in the Middle East, ISIS has been curtailed, has been damaged. There's no question about that. But there's still a formidable terroristic force in the world bent on, harming the United States, among others. And Donald Trump on national TV, recently came out and declared ISIS is dead. We won. Yay. And this is, to me, an enormous national security problem. It's hard to tell whether it's an unknown whether Donald Trump is actually in collusion and and almost working as an agent for foreign governments that are enemies of ours? Or is he just that narcissistic that when he has a particular idea, he will never budge or listen to facts or act accordingly?
Speaking of that, one of the things that we had talked about in our preparation for today, something that I personally didn't know, you mentioned that, and we're talking about the daily briefings. We talked about that. So basically, each and every day, his different security teams provide sort of a summary of daily activity in which they present to the president each morning, and that historically our presidents have woken up in the morning, read this brief, and then used that information to make appropriate decisions. But you said that Donald Trump has gone in a much different direction with these briefs. Can you talk a little bit more about that and share with us how things have changed in this administration?
Well, I think since the beginning of this administration, it has been clear that Donald Trump doesn't like to read reports. He's not that concerned about facts, and he really doesn't spend any time on the business, very little time on the business of running the United States. He has certain preconceived notions, and he runs with those. And we have an $80 billion intelligence apparatus in this country whose sole function is to provide good intelligence so that the higher-ups in this country, including the president, can make sound, rational decisions. Reports are prepared. They go up the channel. Summaries are made. They can make them as simple as possible so they can be digested. And apparently, from all reports, Donald Trump reads very few of these. There's some presidents have had a briefing every morning, and it was Donald Trump's calendar was recently leaked to the press, and we all saw this. But it was one of the most important things of note was out of the last 85 days that you would normally have a briefing, a security briefing, there were only 17 scheduled. So 17 out of 85. The others, he took in new information. He wasn't interested in any information. And the world changes on a minute-to-minute basis. The threats change on a minute-to-minute basis. If you don't stay up with that on a daily basis, that's how you come to these open debates between him and the intelligence community that, Korea's fine. No, they're not. They're still doing this, Mr. President. ISIS is dead. Well, they just killed more people. They had another attack. There's a real disconnect between Donald Trump and much of the reality that goes on in the world. And it's a serious security threat to the people of the United States of America.
So we talked about one final thing before I want to move on to the discussion about climate change is, again, off air while we were preparing for this today, you talked about a specific weapons treaty withdrawal that the United States withdrew themselves from. This was something that I don't believe really was reported in the amount of detail that it probably should have been. Can you enlighten some of our listeners about this weapons treaty withdrawal?
Well, we have many bilateral nuclear treaties with the Soviet Unions. The most notable ones, the ones people know, are the old SALT treaties, SALT I, SALT II, and those were the strategic long-range missiles where they can, carpet bomb all the big cities in the United States with nuclear bombs. And we have those treaties still in place. The world still has far too many nuclear weapons to destroy everybody. But this was, there are other treaties as well, and this one specifically dealt with medium-range missiles, sort of tactical missiles that you could actually use on a battlefield, perhaps, where you're perhaps targeting, smaller nukes in a smaller range, hoping to just take out all the armed forces of a given country, perhaps. And the word has been that the Soviet Union has not been abiding by that treaty as well as we have. Not a big surprise. But anyway, what happened then is Donald Trump said, okay, we're going to withdraw. And it's understandable from some perspectives because the Soviets weren't completely abiding by the treaty. But anytime you abide by a treaty or you abandon a treaty, you sort of leave the opportunity for the other side to ramp up its activity in that area. And to my mind, if you abandon a treaty, you're sort of just taking all holds off, and we will now probably move forward with creating more of those particular class of missiles. And that really, quite frankly, doesn't do the world good.
No, it doesn't at all. Well, one of the other big things that I wanted to talk about here with you today was not only just climate change, but how climate change and maybe some of the progress that we've made over the past 20 to 30 years has really not only come to a halt, but now we are sort of going in the other direction. It started with some changes in coal. And you'd made a point earlier in class today about some of the decreased regulation in the coal industry. Can you share a little bit more about that?
Well, climate change and environmental issues in general, I think, are very much core national security issues. This is the only planet we have. And the world has been moving since, say, the 1960s and 70s. The world has been gradually, sometimes kicking and screaming, but been moving in the direction of more environmental protection, a recognition that it's important to preserve our planet and to, for the benefit of all mankind and Americans particularly here. One thing I want to point out is that this is not a Democratic issue or Republican issue. Most of our initial conservation issues were started by the Republican Party. The original word conservation encompassed being an environmentalist. I consider myself an environmentalist, and to me that means I'm conservative. I'm trying to conserve our resources, not waste them, conserve our environment, conserve the drinking water we have rather than polluting it all, conserve the air we all need to breathe. So I think it's a conservative issue. However, today environmentalists are painted as some kind of screaming liberals. It's not. It's an issue for everyone that everyone should embrace, because unless we, preserve the world we have, we don't yet have someplace else to go in the universe.
What's interesting to me is, and this is, I'm just not going to quote here because I don't have the tweet in front of me, but it was something along the lines of a few weeks back when there was that huge polar vortex. Obviously, we got it pretty bad here, but we were no paling in comparison to the Midwest. In fact, there were certain places, even in our United States, that experienced wind chills of minus 60 to minus 80. And President Trump's response to that was, boy, couldn't we use some global warming right now? Why does that kind of thought process, and taking Trump out of this equation, why does that kind of thought process really deter and is to the detriment of our American society? Because people don't understand that 99.9% of the research out there proves there's some type of climate change going on, and to trivialize it in that manner is extremely going in the wrong direction as far as conservation of our natural resources.
The last 4 out of the last 5 years have been the warmest years on record in history that we have since recorded history. There's no question climate change is taking place. The polar caps are melting, and the effect it has on individual parts of the world, on individual currents, on different things that manipulate the weather around the world is not uniform. Just because we have global warming does not mean everybody's temperature at the same time is going to go up the same amount, or you're not going to have ice storms or polar vortex swoop down from the poles. And people have to realize that it's not a linear equation. Okay, if the world warms, then we're all going to have, nice milder winters, and it's going to be more pleasant in general on the planet. It doesn't work that way. Climate is a very complex situation, and the ocean currents play into it, other things play into it, and they're all being affected by climate change. And whether that means, more El Niños or El Niñas, or more, bloom of toxic algae in the oceans, killing off whole feedstocks of fish. There's so many effects from climate change that we cannot know yet. I think the question that we need to address is that we have to accept that the facts are in. We're undergoing climate change. And those people who believe we can do nothing about it, so therefore we should not take any steps, need to understand that every step that you can take might help. We can't know at this point, because we've gone pretty far, whether we can kind of reverse some of the detrimental effects coming. But to me, it's a criminal to do nothing and know that everything is going to go bad, as opposed to if you can take some steps and see what you can do and see what effect it has and go from there. Now, the climate change accords in general, Paris was a huge deal. Countries have been working for years to come to an agreement, and mostly it's about reducing the carbon footprint and reducing the carbon emissions from each country. And the U.S. is expected to be a world leader in that, and we're a big polluter, and it's
one of the biggest.
Well, it's our job then to work on cleanup as well. And now, does that make doing business more expensive and less profit for some businesses and industries? It does. There's bigger things at stake here, however. One of the things Trump just did was roll back EPA regulations on pollution from smokestacks. The White House's own analysis of that is that it would kill about 1,500 Americans a year from additional respiratory diseases.
So let me get this straight. From some of the regulation rollbacks, the White House's own analysis believes that 1,500 additional people would die due to what?
Due to breathing, to the pollution itself. I mean, we had, if you look back to when I was young, something like the city of Pittsburgh. City of Pittsburgh was so polluted from the steel mills and the coke furnaces belching out smoke that very often there were air hazard days. People had to stay inside. If you saw a picture, a panorama of Pittsburgh, it was a smoke-covered area of the state of Pennsylvania, and a lot of people died of respiratory diseases. That has improved as the environment has improved. Now Pittsburgh is a city of high tech. It's big medical. There's all kinds of different industries there. One of Trump's platforms when he took office was, well, let's revitalize our coal industry. Let's go burn more coal, put more miners back to work. He specifically said in Pittsburgh, we're going to put all your steel mills back together. Well, the people didn't want to experience that again. Well, it's nice to have putting some miners back to work. What's wrong with instead spending that money in education to retrain them for jobs that are going to be here in the future, because coal and other of these fossil fuel industries are inevitably going to die, whether or not we try to prop them up or not. Let's retrain these people for the future. And, just the smokestack regulation, the cutback regulations, they said 1,500 or so people a year. That's every 2 years by that rollback. That's another, 9/11 Twin Towers people dead. I mean, why would you consciously choose that? You choose that because you make money from the big industry, but there has to be less partisanship and more global understanding that everything we do, just like everything everybody else does, affects all of us at this point. The world is not as big as we like to think it is. And when we pull out of something like the Paris Accords, what is the incentive for the smaller countries, for whom it costs much more in terms of their GDP to do something about global warming and pollution? What's their incentive to continue if they see the United States no longer leading in that regard? And to me, that's a national security issue, because not only from the environmental pollution standpoint, but from losing that leadership position in the world. And we've really lost that position of environmental leadership, and we've lost we're losing leadership of the free world because of the positions we take are so anti to what our friends and allies are taking.
And while we record this, one thing that has really been in the news quite a lot is this new Green Deal. Just want to go over, we are going to reserve this because it's still very new, some of the legislation that's being released this week, for the next time that John comes on the podcast. But I just want to kind of read from an article about what some of the platforms are here in terms of renewable energy, meeting 100% of the power demand in the United States through clean, renewable, and zero-emission energy sources. There's discussion about a smart grid, building or upgrading to energy-efficient and smart power grids, and working to ensure affordable access to electricity. There's also something very interesting about transportation, overhauling transportation systems in the United States to eliminate pollution and greenhouse gas emissions. I mean, that alone, John, over the last 20 years, I'd say the auto industry has at least made a fair attempt to try to reduce some of the greenhouse emissions from just basic emission tests in state of Pennsylvania to, developing more hybrid cars and electric cars. But our infrastructure in our country is so heavily rooted in petroleum. I mean, this could take multiple generations for even just that one thing to even be a reality in terms of where we currently stand. Wouldn't you agree?
It will take generations. Much of this stuff has been in the works for a long time through multiple presidential administrations. We have pressed the auto industry to improve emissions, to improve mileage in the car fleets and the truck fleets. And very often they've come kicking and screaming, but they're on board, and they have been every year releasing new technology that helps. As a matter of fact, the President Trump just recently, I don't know if he did this, but he's been talking about relaxing the mileage standards that the government already has in place for manufacturers. They're being held to get their entire fleets across their fleets down up with the gas mileage to a certain mileage per gallon, to help with emissions. And President Trump just has said that he's rolling back those standards or those goals. So once again, the industry is actually doing more than, in this case, the president. Instead of asking them to keep working on it and doing more, he says, well, let's roll this back so maybe cars are $100 cheaper.
Why don't more auto manufacturers just say, you know what, we're done with gas. We have the technology to use alternative fuel sources. Why don't, and is it, maybe you already just answered that question. Maybe it's because there is no regulation and they can continue just going to the status quo. But why do you think that the auto manufacturers aren't kind of taking the lead on this?
Some of them are. Some of them have already committed to having completely electric fleets very soon. That, however, raises a different issue. Much of our electricity in this country is produced with fossil fuels. So just switching cars from gasoline to electric eliminates the pollution at the tailpipe, but it doesn't eliminate the pollution from gas-fired and oil-fired and coal-fired power plants that produce the electricity. You still have to get the power from somewhere. I think you mentioned that, the new Green Deal, and I have not studied this yet, but it's
still relatively new.
It looks like a hash of a lot of different proposals and different platforms from different parties, like the Green Party and others in the past, put together to try to push this as a goal. Even the limited amount you just cited there, we're not going to achieve in my lifetime. But, the goal is we should keep working forward. Will that platform be adopted in total? Never, but bits and pieces. I think if you put that platform or this goal out there, it at least helps move the needle here and there to achieve parts of it, and everything helps.
Last question, because a big part of this new Green Deal is a dramatic increase in taxes. While we as individuals might not be guilty of making the environment much worse, do you think we're responsible to pay for it?
Everyone needs to share in that. The question is, how are they coming up with those costs? What are they looking at? Where are they? I don't know enough about this whole package to see what their proposals are and why it necessitates, in a given case, additional taxes on the American consumer. We have a lot of issues going on in this country. Our entire infrastructure, our eastern cities have 200-year-old terracotta sewer systems running open under our streets. There are billions and billions of dollars that we need to put in a lot of important areas. Environmentalism and climate change being some of them, but there's got to be a balance, and from a political standpoint and a raising capital balance standpoint, it has to be a balance. And the American, the American population can only foot the bill for so much. We have, if you look at where should some of this money come, I think of this as a national security issue. We spend about $675 billion a year on defense. Now that's twice as much as China.
Well more than twice. Absolutely.
And it's 4 times as much as the Soviet Union. There's a lot of waste in the defense spending. Think about if you could take, if you're spending $675 billion a year, and you just take $100 billion a year out of that pot and put it toward these other issues, you'd get some traction. You'd make some progress. So, I mean, I think we have to look at our expenditures on a global basis. And I hearken back all the way to President Eisenhower, Republican president, general that won Second World War in Europe for us. When he left office, he said, beware of the military-industrial complex because it's growing at such a rate that it's just going to suck us dry and bleed us dry, and that's where all our money will go. And that's where we've been. And that's where we continue to go. I think the United States, the world has to revisit its priorities. If we can broker some kinds of treaties, instead of pulling out of treaties, let's agree to a few more treaties. Every place we can cut back expenditures for killing people is perhaps a spot where we can use that money to help people be healthy, to live.
Well, John, it's always such a pleasure to have you down as our political correspondent on the Nightly News Podcast. Did just want to put out a quick reminder to everyone. I don't know if we'll have you back in time for this, John, but May the 21st is our next primary election. So please make sure you circle that date on your calendar. Make sure you get out to the polls.
Will do.
All right. Well, John, it's always a pleasure, and we appreciate you so much. And, of course, we'd love to have you back here in the very near future.
Well, thank you very much, Paul. Always a pleasure.
All right. So for Senior Deputy Attorney General of the state of Pennsylvania, John Butchar, this is Professor Paul Miller, and we will catch you again next time on the Nightly News Podcast.